Good morning, everyone. We're in Ottawa this morning. I'm very happy to be here. This is our first press conference of the 2025 election. Bonjour, bienvenue, mesdames et messieurs. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Grant Abraham. I'm the leader of the United Party of Canada, and I'm here to briefly chat with you this morning and introduce our platform to you. But we're really talking now in Canada about Reforging Canada for free Canadians. So the United Party of Canada was birthed in late 2023. It is a grassroots, bottom-up, small c, classic Conservative party that establishes value in the identity of every Canadian. It reestablishes the bedrock values that built the nation. It loves and celebrates the culture, values, and traditions of our people. It stands in solemn opposition to the breaking of the social contract with Canadians and the treasonous ideology of post-nationalism. It recognizes the supremacy of God and the rule of law as the foundation for strength, and recognizes the merit of the Christian ethos of this nation. We value peace through strength in relation to the protection of our borders and the development of our military for this nation. Canada has now some incredibly corrosive problems. There is ideology pretending to be leadership in this country. We're creating an economic suicide that is dressed up as climate control. We have high taxes, foolish spending, and destabilizing debt. We have two-tier policing, a tattered constitution with credibility that follows along with the tattering. We have a fragmented unity in this nation. We have a Western portion of this country that is alienated and consistently talking about independence and separation. We have the abandonment of 300,000 Jews in this country, and the best that we can say is that we're opposed to anti-Semitism, constantly talking about symptoms without ever dealing with the root causes. We have the mocking of religious Canadians. We have a declared reset of this nation. Justin Trudeau said that COVID has provided us with an opportunity for a reset. We have a declared post-national intention. Canada will become the first post-national state. We have rampant foreign interference that has been tolerated by the leadership government and uncontested by the Conservatives. In fact, all three of these things are heinous enough and insidious enough to the undermining of our people. Yet we've had 3 leadership elections in the Conservative Party and 2 federal elections. And when have you ever heard Canadians ask the question, what does post-nationalism mean? What does it really mean? What does the reset mean? Or why aren't we talking about foreign interference when David McGuinty actually went on YouTube and referred to the foreign interference as having ample evidence of severe and sustained foreign interference that's undermining our democratic processes? These are huge issues for for Canada. And when we look at the context that we're in, we have many geopolitical pressures that are being put on the Canadian people in addition to the economic challenges. We need to be talking about those in Canada. And we now have a request on that point from our neighbor to deal with our border. President Trump is not asking Canada to deal with the quality of chicken or the bacterial metrics with regard to our eggs. He's asking us to deal with fentanyl production and human trafficking, and to make sure that we're good neighbors and maintain a good fence on the border. And it's shocking to me that the response from value-based Canadians who we would know wish to see fentanyl stopped, the organized crime of human trafficking stopped, that our government is choosing to create a retaliatory response to the Americans and actually vilify the Americans for asking us to clean up our own backyard. This is shocking to me. It was more shocking to me when I heard Pierre Poilievre suggest that we're going to offer Canadians through the Conservative Party also retaliatory tariffs. And so it's time in Canada for a new voice. It's time in Canada to engage a sensible response. I'm so tired of hearing common sense conservative policies without any common sense. And this discussion today is a little bit of a lead in to what we're offering as a platform to Canadians from Alberta, substantively, but for all Canadians across the country, because we want to reforge this nation and have free Canadians across this country. So what do we need to do? First thing that we need to do is we need to create a pathway to establish the Canadian people as the sovereign. We need to lose the crown. We need to move towards a constitutional republic and sort out our issues of the electoral imbalances and the equalization payments that are difficult for many parts of our country, particularly Western Canada. We need to unleash our economic power and energy. We need to make Canadians wealthier and make their life more affordable. We need to let them dream again so that they can buy houses and they can actually engage the dreams that they have for their futures and that they can build families. This is how our nation was built: strong families and strong communities. We need to strengthen our military and secure our borders. Right now, we're contributing 1.2% of our GDP to the military. I'd like to see that increase to 2 to 3%, so we can actually be proud of our defenses in this country again for Canadians, protect our borders, and reestablish the amazing relationship that Canadian Armed Forces have had internationally. We need to secure gun rights and protect legal gun ownership. This is a huge issue. It's constantly being eroded, and a part of a constitutional reform would be to establish guns as part of a constitutional right. We need to return to responsible immigration and link our immigration to an economic plan that defines what it is we need to accelerate growth in this country, but not burden the people with extra taxes because we're bringing in the wrong immigrants. We need to recognize that multiculturalism has failed. We need to move to integrate our people again around the culture, values, and traditions that's built this nation. We need to support strong families and defend life again. We have a death cult in this country. We want to reforge Canada for free Canadians. This is particularly an issue with regard to the threat of post-nationalism. It's talked about all the time. In fact, Mr. Carney refers to himself as an elitist and a globalist, and that, at its root, undermines an inherent value in our nation, which is the value of the individual and our sovereignty as a people. And post-nationalism takes Canadians away from a democratic process at a grassroots that elects accountable government and removes that government accountability to someone else, somewhere else. And we see this evidence in the legislation that we're signing internationally in the form of UNDRIP, United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or with regard to what a pandemic is and who will make the decisions about your health in Canada. And this is not the wish of Canadians. This is not the intention of our forefathers in setting up this nation. And the message really for the post-nationalist globalist agenda is that you will be resisted at all costs. And I don't know that anyone's actually ever said that in Canada to you before, but you need to know that there's a free people in this nation that resist the intentionality of the deconstruction of this nation. And it's time that this nation has this conversation. I would like to move just a little bit to comment on Alberta, because right now Alberta is at the centrality of the discussion around independence. This has a lot to do with energy. There's a constitutional discussion here that I hope I'll get to talk to with Canadians as this election unfolds. But I'd like to say to Premier Smith and to Albertans that there is a peaceful and lawful pathway to secure sovereignty for Alberta in opposition to post-national tyranny. What Alberta needs and what it requires and what it deserves is a guaranteed access to energy corridors in the north, the East, and the West. Alberta requires Bill C-69 to be repealed. That is the bill that prohibits new pipelines in Canada. We need to see the lifting of the tanker ban off the BC coast so that tankers can move oil again on sea, on water. We need to eliminate the oil and gas emissions cap. That is an energy cap. We need to understand that. It needs to be removed. We need to deal with the Paris Climate Accord. I find it ironic that the Conservative Party talks about unleashing our energy sector, but adheres to the Paris Climate Accord. It's such a paradox, and I hope Canadians are listening to that and realize that there's hollow promises inside of the omission to act of the Conservative Party in relation to post-nationalism. We need to look at these omissions. The Liberal Party is committing the undermining of our nation, and the Conservative Party has omitted to challenge it. We need to scrap the clean energy regulations that have been put in place in Canada. We need to end the prohibition of single-use plastics. We need to abandon net zero. We are already at net zero in Canada. We need to establish an industrial tax that the provinces control, not the federal government. And we need to halt the federal censorship of energy companies and allow them to be managed provincially. With regard to the United States, I think the Americans have been given an unfair rap, and President Trump in particular, because he is simply asking the Canadians and challenging us, and perhaps facetiously by saying we'll be the 51st state. But I'd like to remind Canadians that what he's actually asking us to do is to clean up our backyard. I alluded to that a few moments ago. And what decent Canadian doesn't want to stop fentanyl production at an industrial scale, or human trafficking, or deal with the infrastructure of crime that's behind that? And the embracing of tariffs in this country by both parties is actually a signaling to support organized crime and have decent, hardworking Canadians in businesses that are paying tax suffer the tariff implications. If I were Prime Minister, I would have organized crime defined as a cartel. I would perceive it as a threat to our nation, and I would ensure that we were directing the appropriate instruction to our enforcement to use the appropriate force to deal with it in the circumstances. We need to clean that up, not use President Trump as a tool to be used in our political conversation to obfuscate or hide the real issues that are being discussed. That's what's going on. So to the Americans that are listening, I would say, you need to understand that Canada is broken and increasingly ruled by a post-national agenda that is an anti-human death cult. The free people of Canada have to be understood to be distinguishable and different from the bureaucratic infrastructure that is self-perpetuating in our government. The Canadian people have been taken hostage by a broken system. Canada is facing a unity crisis and is increasingly unstable given the polarizing forces that are here in this country. We have the free people of Canada versus the post-national globalist. We have light versus darkness. We have truth versus propaganda. And we have God-given identity versus collectivism. We have a clear and resolute plan to fix this, to reforge Canada for free Canadians. We want to see us move away from this tattered infrastructure of the Crown and move towards a new constitution in this country where we understand that we have inalienable rights that are given to us by God and that government is there to serve the people under those rights. And so in conclusion, I would just like to leave my final comments to a few declarative statements because I don't have time to go through all of the policies that are on our platform. You can find our policies on our platform on the unitedpartyofcanada.ca. But just a few points of clarification to give you some insight into where we're going. the first thing I'd like to say is that there are only two sexes. Oil and gas are a requirement for human prosperity. Reverse racism is racism. Parents need to determine the education of their children. The nuclear family is the greatest form of governance known to humanity. Compelled speech is not a Canadian value. Truth, justice, and righteousness, when I use that word righteousness, I mean making the crooked straight. Truth, justice, and righteousness set within the canopy of the supremacy of God and the rule of law establishes a secure and prosperous nation. Capitalism lifts a nation from poverty. Farmers are producers and not polluters. Facts are not enough. Canada has a deep crisis of identity and meaning, and it requires leadership to step in again and begin to talk about the values that bring us together as a people. Canada has a culture value and traditions that define us. We've been told that we have no identity. Let me say that again. Canada does have a culture and a value system and traditions that define us, and it is a lie for us to feel shame about those. We have unalienable rights that are given by God and cannot be taken away by government. And I think what I'm really saying again is we sing in our national anthem, God keep our land glorious and free, but never take note of this. And the declaration that I'm really making again over this country is that I'm invoking the supremacy of God over this land again as a light over the darkness that is stretching across our nation. And so let me just thank everyone for coming today. That concludes my remarks. I'd like to take a few questions from the people in the room here now, if they have any, and we'll then move to conclude this in about 10 minutes, this press conference. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much. You talked about Dan, you mentioned Danielle Smith, and she, we're good neighbors. You talked about us being neighbors with each one of the provinces getting along. But obviously there are issues in our country. The East versus the West. Being if you've been the Prime Minister, how would you address these issues? What would it mean forging or reforging? How would it look like?
So I'm not sure if everyone could hear that question. The question was essentially one of the, I think, if I'll reinterpret it slightly, is that Alberta is driving this discussion about independence right now. What does that look like in relation to Canada, and what does reforging really mean in the context of our Constitution and some of the changes that we need to make, and some of the comments that I've alluded to, I think, here. Is that a fair representation of your question?
Yes.
Okay. So I think that what we need to go back and look at is that Canada has been created, and I've made this comment as in my book that I've written, The Battle for the Soul of Canada, and I've said that ultimately Canada was set up, and Western Canada in particular, as a colony of a colony. And that was that Canada was a colony of the United Kingdom, and then what looked like a good idea to what we now refer to as Central Canadians was extended to the West, supporting Central Canada. And in the nation's development, I suppose there was an argument for that, but it's become now a polarizing issue in the country, particularly when one considers that since the early 60s until now, Alberta's on the way to having transfer payments nearly $1 trillion to Central Canada. And as Western Canada has now grown up, that's become an issue. As Western Canada is seeing the flimsiness of the Constitution and what that meant in relation to bank accounts being frozen, or even indeed peaceful protesters being stomped upon not far from where we're talking this morning. And yet there seem to be other demonstrations that are welcomed in this nation that are burning our flag and calling for the death of the nation. there seems to be a system that isn't working and something that seems to be more malevolent and malevolently with intention for against our nation. So there's all of those issues, and then there's the financial discussion. And I just think people have come to the place where they're fed up and they're wanting to leave under any pretense. President Trump, I think, has triggered some of those questions by suggesting that Canada will be the 51st state. And I think to answer that question, I think we need to rethink what President Trump is saying. He's basically saying we are hosting threats on our northern border that he is not prepared to have permeate his northern border because we're not dealing with some of the garbage in our backyard. And so that is what he's saying to us. He's saying you'll become Americans before you become a post-national state. And I think that's the starting point. That has triggered and I suppose helped give some momentum to this independence movement in Alberta. Being from Alberta, I can tell you that there are some people that would like to join the US, but there's many people that wish to come out from under tyranny. And so right now, Canadians have only been presented with kind of a two bus stop choice: stay in tyranny or become American. And what we're proposing and what I'm proposing is that there's a peaceful pathway in this discussion that actually harkens back to some of our constitutional history. And in that, I specifically mean this 1931 Westminster Act. And it's a very clear and simple act. Most of the time Canadians, go to sleep when they start having to listen to a constitutional discussion. But that act from London was quite profound because of what it actually did was sever the connection of the Crown to the colony of Canada. And it didn't give it to the federal government of Canada as it was then. It gave it to the people of Canada. So the sovereignty moved from the Crown to the people with the instruction that that sovereignty would have legislative effect through provincial legislatures. And the provincial legislatures would define the federal state. And so that was an amazing freedom that was actually extended nearly 100 years ago, yet seems to have been appropriated by other intentions and perpetuated by continuing to hang the crown over Canada. And so for a long time, maybe that hasn't mattered because we've worked under the framework of peace, order, and good government. But now we're seeing something that we just cannot tolerate anymore. And this is why I say this country is at a breaking point. The economic engine in Alberta needs to be reviewed and treated fairly. There's an equalization payment issue. There's electoral reform required. And I think that we need to look at this issue. It's going to there's a wave that is going to push this forward in Canada. And what I'm endeavoring to do through this election is say to Albertans that this is actually an election that is the first referendum on moving Canadians and Alberta first into the freedom that we were supposed to have. And now it's important because we are facing a tyrannical infrastructure that's telling us that it's going to have a very different form of government, and no one's asking them what that is. And so that's a question that Canadian people need to be asking their Liberal MPs or their Conservative MPs if they think the Conservative Party is going to protect them. Why aren't you asking what is post-nationalism? Why aren't you asking what does a reset mean? Why haven't you asked that in the last 5 years since COVID when Justin Trudeau said that? Why aren't we talking about foreign interference? Why do we have a situation now where there's 11 MPs that seem to be the targets of foreign interference, and Canadians are going to polls to vote for people that may actually be under the influence of foreign agents? It's a completely unacceptable situation for any free-thinking Canadian that wants a free Canada. The only person that would tolerate that is someone that wants a globalist nation and is working to a foreign power. And this is the conversation that we need to have in Canada together and start seeing things straight. So for my part, I'm grateful for what President Trump has actually said to Canadians, because what he's doing is he's allowing us to see the real issues that are going on and no doubt the Americans have a very good insight into. And I think it was particularly interesting to see the Conservative Party come out with retaliatory tariffs, because that's a surprise. Because why wouldn't we want to stop human trafficking and the production of fentanyl in the country? And we're not, again, talking about 10 kilos being snuck across the Manitoba border at night. We're talking about sea cans from Vancouver and significant money laundering moving through Toronto and Vancouver. We need a new political voice for this. We need a new political expression that is actually going to elevate truth and justice again in this country and stop pretending. Yes.
Thank you. My question would be, when I talk to my friends, I say, we really need to do something to stand up for sovereignty, particularly Christian people. And the answer I get back all the time is, well, church, I pray and will win people that way, I pray for them. And then they say Christians shouldn't be involved in politics.
Well, I think there's been a discussion in Canada for a long time as Canadians, where we've been told that we have to have the separation between the secular and the sacred. And I think part of that truth, it sounded very good in the 70s and 80s and 90s when we were all groomed into that understanding, because we thought, Canada's a good country and no one wants to have any religious stuff hoisted upon them. But I think what really happened was that we didn't see the fact that the actual secularist agenda was a form of religious ethos, because where we've moved to in the country now is a scenario where we are having our children sexualized. We have a very unacceptable gender fluidity policy in our schools, and we have the normalization of pedophilia. And I've spent the last 2 years crossing this country back and forth, and I haven't found very many people that are okay with that or happy about it. And so I think my point is that secularism is a sacred force. It's a force that opposes what most Canadians that I talk to perceive and believe. And in a sense, it's a cultural grooming that has actually caused a lot of the Christians in Canada, if you will. And the last census had 53.3% of the population identifying with the Christian faith. The census before that had different questions, and it was 60%. And so this is a real discussion in Canada right now, because many Canadians feel like they need to kind of keep their value system isolated, because in some way it's rooted in the supremacy of God and the rule of law, and they don't feel comfortable talking about that. Yet we have a constant erosion in all these areas that we don't accept. So I am now really jettisoning that cultural grooming and saying, no, we have to be able to have these conversations in our nation, because what's happening is the value degradation is actually breaking apart the country, and we're moving towards chaos. And so that's a great question, and it's really a question about the framework, the sociological framework with which we need to work in this country, and recognize that for a long time there's been almost a neutralizing of voices, because the country was big enough to tolerate and accept everything, except that now we can no longer do that without having these conversations. And there's some things in Canada that we have to talk about in relation to what we are prepared to be compatible with from the perspective of our culture, values, and traditions. Any other questions here today? Yes.
Talked a bit about the post-nationalistic march or tangent that the current governments are taking. Can you expand a bit on, we're talking about, international interference, and there's all kinds of other issues around that. Can you expand a bit on that? And also, how do we, as a nation and as citizens, how do we stop that progression?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, post-nationalism, this thing that's been undefined in Canada, really is happening. And a lot of people don't know how to deal with it because, in fairness, no one has ever had to think about it, really, unless you've been an academic or watched what was going on in Europe with regard to the UK leaving the European Union. That's really what Brexit was all about. That was the United Kingdom saying to the European Union or to a post-national governmental system, we're not okay with the democratic deficit, which means we're not okay with someone else making our laws and having them define who we are. They were saying to the European Union, we want to take back control of our money, our laws, our borders, our culture. And that is why the British people looked and said, you know what, this experiment that was started out as a good economic idea, but then became a cultural force, the British stepped out of. And that is the same agenda that is being perpetrated upon Canadians right now. I think it's not a surprise that the first trip that Mr. Carney went on was to Europe. And I find Chrystia Freeland's comments about seeking nuclear support from France and Britain to be shocking and dangerous. And that is exactly what post-nationalism is. We need to recognize who our friends and allies are. And we need to revisit this discussion about what the President of the United States is actually saying to Canada, and think carefully on that. And he, of course, he's taking an America first position, but he's actually giving us the forewarning to think about the fact that there are forces at work that he's not prepared to tolerate being in existence in Canada, even if there is this pretense of democracy that's keeping them in power. And this is the challenge. So we're dealing now in Canada with the geopolitical reality, not just a political reality. And I think we need to understand that and have our conversations in this election in a broader context so we understand what is actually going on. And the challenge with the mainstream media is they will never have this conversation and expand it other than vilifying what it is that the American intelligence community is seeing and what President Trump is actually saying to Canadians, regardless of how we choose to understand his specific verbal syntax. One more question. Yes.
We've been talking about geopolitical and all that now. My question to you is, we've been taxed ever since I've been working. It's been 50 years I've been working, paying taxes. Every year taxes are going up. And now it seems like even more than ever, as our money is leaving the country, going to foreign, not helping our people. Our government, I find our government is very top heavy. And a lot of money are going towards government employees. Would you say that it would be reasonable to downsize the head of the government?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes, but let me just expand upon it a little bit. I think that Canada as a house is on fire. And we need to see that there are forces that are actually ripping apart the fabric of this nation. And at its core, there's a corrosion going on that is actually helping to deconstruct the country. And part of it, that deconstruction, is the financial mechanism that's actually making us poorer and seeing our resources sent overseas, and in many cases for foolish reasons that many Canadians would never agree to. So when I have this conversation with Canadians, there's no need for us to have that level of taxes. We should be much wealthier than we are. There's been a centrality of control in terms of our economic prosperity. Our taxes are through the roof. But actually, the real issue for us is the fire. And the fire right now in Canada is the agenda to deconstruct the resiliency of the Canadian people and their economic independence. And so we have to look at the root issues again in this nation and understand that what you're talking about are the symptoms, because the policy is actually to make the Canadian people weaker. And so we need to have that conversation. And I guess there's all kinds of economic things, inflation or fiscal or monetary policy that we could talk about, but we have to understand that before we can kind of do repairs on the walls or fix the doors or light switches of our house, we have to take care of the people that we love inside, get them out, and stop the fire. And in a sense, that's what this election's about. And if we actually unleash our economy and our resources, there's no need for anywhere near half the taxes that we're paying or energy costs. And that's going to start to deal with the issues like the price of housing or access to housing. So there's so much to fix, but in any crisis, we have to deal with the issues that are emergent first. So I'd like to conclude this conversation today here. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And this concludes this press conference. Thank you very much.